Welcome back, guys. We're talking today about the 1960s. This is a really stormy period and tumultuous, and it's a really difficult time in the United States after the 50s, which was seemingly very easy and so many cultural changes. And so we're going to talk today about the 1960s, and we're going to start out on this very first slide with President Kennedy. This is Top Up. This is U.S. History, and I'm Dr. Chris Erskine, so let's just jump right in. John F. Kennedy was President of the United States, elected in 1960, November, takes office in 1961, January. John Kennedy, we also call him Jack Kennedy or JFK, is from Massachusetts. He's a Democrat. He's 43 years old when he takes office. He's our first Catholic president. And his campaign message is, "We can do better." This is his slogan. The next slide, this within just a couple of months of when he comes into office. So he comes into office in January, then we have January, we have February, March, and April. We have 3 months, just less than 3 months, 1961. There's this plan in action when President Kennedy comes into office. It's put into plan, the plan is put into action by President Eisenhower, and the attempt is to overthrow Castro. Castro took power in Cuba in 1959 in a revolution, and the United States doesn't like him because he's very close friends with the Soviet Union, with Russia. And Cuba is not that far from the United States. If you look at a map of the United States and Florida, Cuba is just south of us, not that far. And so we didn't want a communist dictator taking over in Cuba and making a threat to the United States. And so the United States wanted Castro out of power. And so when Kennedy comes into office, he has this plan before him to overthrow Castro. Now, the plan was that we would take Cubans that are in the United States and we'll dress them up like Cuban soldiers. We'll paint CIA airplanes to look like Cuban airplanes in the Cuban Air Force. We'll fly in, we'll invade, and we'll take over. Well, it didn't work. At the last minute, the United States cut the invasion in half. We dropped the paratroopers in, but we failed to send the Navy in to bombard and support them. In the Bay of Pigs, as it's called, because it takes place in the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. It's an utter and total failure, and it's an embarrassment for President Kennedy. And he's angry. He's angry with himself, and he's angry with the generals and the military men that led him to this position. Just about a year or two later, in October, the Soviet Union is preparing medium-range ballistic missiles. They're preparing to send them to Cuba. These could be nuclear missiles. And we have satellite photos, and we can see these on the next slides. We have satellite photos that show from an airplane, a U-2 airplane that was taken, that was flying over Cuba, and these photos are taken. And it shows these missiles in Cuba, and they're coming from the Soviet Union. And so this brings us to the brink of nuclear war. What does the United States do? Well, Kennedy says, we're going to tell the Soviet Union to get those missiles out of Cuba, and we're going to tell Castro to get those missiles out of Cuba. And for 13 days in October, the United States is on the seat, on the edge of its seat, waiting for nuclear war to happen, and the entire world could be destroyed by nuclear war. Kennedy sets up a blockade. He creates a circle of American Navy ships around Cuba because the Soviet Union is going to bring in more supplies or perhaps more missiles to give to the Cubans. And the United States is prepared on Kennedy's order that if the Soviet Union Navy ships cross through the blockade, cross through this circle that we have around Cuba, that we will start a war with the Soviet Union. Kennedy doesn't want it. Khrushchev doesn't want it. He's the chairman of the Communist Party in Russia. The Soviet Union Navy ships stops. And thankfully, the war is over. But the United States made a deal with the Russians. The Russians said, we'll take the missiles out of Cuba if you take your nuclear missiles out of Turkey. And so that was the deal. The United States said, okay, we'll take them out, but not right now. But in the end, both sides were able to prevent the world from being totally destroyed. On the next slide, we see that in 1960 there was a test ban treaty, meaning we're not going to test nuclear weapons, and it's pointless. We have nuclear weapons. We know that they work. We don't need to test them in the desert. We don't need to test them in the ocean. We're finished testing them because it's bad, and we just want to be peaceful. And so this is good. But remember, shortly after the Bay of Pigs in April of 1960, 1961 is when Kennedy was shortly after he was elected, was the Bay of Pigs. But just before he took office, in May of 1960, there was a pilot in a U-2 plane named Gary Powers who was shot down over the Soviet Union. And this was embarrassing for the United States. There was this string of embarrassments for the United States leading into Kennedy's presidency and in the first 2 or 3 years after his presidency. Now, when he comes into office, he is at 43 the youngest president. He is the president who is the first Catholic. A lot of good things about Kennedy. But in 1963, November, he's in Dallas and he's assassinated. Now, the picture that we see here is a picture after he's just been shot. There's 2 bullets that hit Kennedy. The first one comes through his shoulder and goes through his shoulder and hits the man in front of him. Now you can see the man that's in the front of him in the right. This is the governor of Texas. His name is John Connally. John Connally is right under the number 312. John Connally is governor of Texas, and that bullet that goes through Kennedy, Kennedy's in the back seat, hits Connally, goes through his shoulder, down his arm, down into his leg, and it's damaging him. But you can see he's turned as well. Now, that's the first bullet. The second bullet hits Kennedy, and if you can watch this, you can watch this video on Yoku or online on the internet, and you can see this is someone's home video. It's called this Pruder Films. And this film, in the next instant, the next bullet hits Kennedy in the head, and the top of his head kind of pops off, and it lands in his wife's lap, and Kennedy falls over. And Americans saw this video over and over and over. And the last president that we had assassinated was McKinley in 1898. He was elected in 1898. And McKinley, and this was, we didn't have TV in the 1890s, and so no one actually saw that assassination take place. But everyone can see this, and it was a very sad time for Americans. This is a decade of assassinations. JFK is assassinated in November of 1963. Malcolm X is a civil rights leader. He's assassinated in 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in April of 1968. We're going to talk about Martin Luther King. And Bobby Kennedy, who was JFK's brother, Bobby Kennedy is running for president, and he's assassinated in New York in June of 1968. So Kennedy's lost 2 brothers. There's a third Kennedy brother named Ted. Teddy Kennedy runs for president a couple of times, but he's never elected president. As soon as Kennedy is assassinated on November 22, 1963, now I want you to look at this picture, is the new president, Lyndon Johnson. And the woman to Lyndon Johnson's left is President Kennedy's wife, Jackie, or Jacqueline Kennedy. And she still has the clothes on that her husband, the blood stains from her husband. This is only 90 minutes after Kennedy's assassinated. Lyndon Johnson is sworn in. He's got his hand up and he says, I swear to follow the Constitution and to protect Americans. And he's sworn in as President of the United States. And he's on Air Force One, which is the airplane that the president flew on. You can see this picture is the big picture here, and a lot of Americans don't like Lyndon Johnson. We also call him LBJ because his name was Lyndon Baines Johnson. A lot of Americans don't like Lyndon Johnson because he wasn't a very nice person. But his presidency, he wasn't a bad president for domestic policy and for international policy. We'll talk more about that in the next lesson because he was very controversial. But Kennedy's presidency, Kennedy was elected in 1960, he's assassinated in 1963, and it's just a really devastating time for Americans when he's assassinated. So we'll talk to you in the next lesson. We'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.